Okay, we're talking about Husserl. And he was a phenomenologist. In fact, he gets the big title of father of phenomenology. And phenomenology is the philosophical discipline that states only what you perceive is real. Okay. Unfortunately, it leads to what's called solipsism. And solipsism is this idea that you are the only real existing being, and everything else is a projection from you. I actually had a friend, a coworker once, quite brilliant guy, and he told me he was a phenomenologist, and I said, so am I just a figment of your imagination? And he said, yep, and you are a wild one. But he couldn't make me go away. And it's just so interesting to think about it in that sense, that basically out of sight, out of mind, out of reality. But if you're not perceiving it, it's not existing. And so it's kind of like taking Berkeley's to be is to be perceived to a whole new level, right? Mm-hmm. But it really focuses on the connection between perception and reality, or what we perceive as what is real. And I would qualify it by saying to us. I still believe there's a external reality apart from my personal subjective experiences. I mean, I'm not that much of an egomaniac that I think when I go to sleep at night, the entire cosmos disappears and the only reality is what's happening in my dreams. And then the whole cosmos reemerges in the morning when I wake. I mean, that's intense, right? But I certainly believe in a subjective sense that what I'm perceiving is my reality. Absolutely. It's going to shape my understanding of the world, what I think is real. And I'm just aware enough to know that I can't perceive everything. There's lots of things that are beyond my range of perception, but with certain tools or aids, I can perceive them. I'm like something as simple as infrared or ultraviolet. But I would also add that to the spiritual realm. I believe in a whole realm of things that are beyond my sense perceptions. I have to perceive them differently, like through the spirit. Husserl influences other philosophers that come after him, and one of the later notable existential philosophers. I mean, I gave you a real sampler of Nietzsche and Sartre and Camus, but Heidegger, he kind of fell into discredit because he was like the philosopher of the Nazis, of the Third Reich, where other people had either fled the country or were willing to be imprisoned or whatever for not going along with National Socialism or the Nazi Party. Husserl did what he had to do to survive. And I don't know, maybe he was a devotee of Hitler. Maybe he was just being expedient. I don't know. But he wrote some really interesting philosophy. And so if you can get past his association with National Socialism, I think he has some really interesting things to share with us. And it has to do with phenomenology and being. And his epic work is called Being and Time. And he believed that ever since Socrates, the philosophers have completely gotten it wrong and have like derailed the whole project into the ditch, because philosophy got so focused on things that it let go of studying being. And he said, we have to understand being, not just things or objects, but beings and subjects. And I love that. I mean, you see the existential connection there. And he basically believed that this had been going on in philosophy, like I said, all the way to the ancient Greeks. And he wanted to study being. but he believed being was a very difficult thing to study because it was like underground. It was subliminal. It's kind of like my description of the self. Like, how are we supposed to know the self? Because if we're using the self to understand everything else in the world, how do we make the self look at itself? There's no vantage point from which the self can know itself. Like the human eye, we see it to see all other things, but we can't take our eye out and look at our own eye with it. And being is kind of like one of those things. It's like, we know we're beings, we're living beings, we're interacting in the world with other beings, but how are we supposed to see or know what that being is? And so in his book, Being and Time, he begins to explore, like, it's almost like you have to catch being in action. And he's trying to come up with techniques of how we catch it. But before I get into that, I learned a new Greek word for truth from Heidegger that I didn't know before. Even though I grew up in Christian circles, went to a Christian college, went to tons of Bible classes and theology, it took this German Nazi philosopher to teach me this really profound Greek concept of truth. And the Greeks, just like for love or other things, have multiple words because they were so precise in abstract thinking. And so this word for truth, now we already talked about the law of non-contradiction, like something can't be one thing and another thing simultaneously. It's either black or it's white, it's right or it's wrong, it's male or it's female. That's a very Western Aristotelian way of thinking. The other truth I shared with you was correspondence theory of truth. This idea that if we make a truth claim, like my mug is in my hand, does that statement correspond with physical material reality? You once again see the Aristotelian influence there, that this is reality, right? Not this or the abstract thoughts. So that's correspondence theory of truth. Does what we say match reality, or is it non-contradictive? But Heidegger says there's another type of truth, and it's a much more existential type of truth. And the Greek word is aletheia. And aletheia means that which is unveiled or revealed. And I'm just geeking out on this word. And so if you look at a lie as that which is covered or hidden, and the truth as that which is uncovered or unveiled, that's what this is connotating. That's this kind of truth. It's not propositional truth. It's like an uncovering or an unveiling of what's there. And are you guys familiar with the old parable, the 5 blind men and the elephant? Where none of these men had encountered an elephant before, and someone had brought an elephant to town, and these 5 blind men went out and, using their other senses, were interacting with this new creature. And the first blind man, who grabbed its trunk, he said, "Wow, it's like a powerful snake, and it turns and twists and can grab things." And the next blind man grabbed its tusk, and he said, "What are you talking about? It's like a pole or a spear." And snake, I mean, this is as like firm and rigid as you can get. And then the third blind man's like, "What are you talking about? It's like a tree," because he was holding on to one of the legs. And the fourth one said, "No, it's like a house," because he was touching the side. And the last one had a hold of its tail, and he says, "No, it's like a whip or a fan, it's just this little thing." And the point and parable of that story is they were all partially right, but none of them had the entire elephant unveiled to them. So because they only saw partial truth, they were misled, and it's really equivalent to a lie. But if you accept this definition of truth, it means there's only one truth teller in the cosmos, because there is only one being to whom all things are unveiled. That's not Heidegger, that's Blackburn. Blackburn's application. And
I
that just blows me away.
have a little thought that ties with that, that I've thought about before, but makes perfect sense in that context. Where, you know, the story of Jesus when he was walking through the crowd and the woman who'd been sick and had been bleeding grabbed the edge of his robe, and then he comes back and like has a face-to-face conversation with her, relates to her, talks to her, makes her feel seen and known, right? It's this interesting concept that I have, that I see in myself and in other people in Christianity. And sometimes it's fine, but we reach out to Jesus and we grab the edge of his robe. We grasp the tiny part of him that we can understand. And that in and of itself isn't wrong. Sometimes that's all we can grasp. But we have to not hold on to the edge of his robe and insist that that is the entirety of Jesus. Because what he desires is not for us to grasp onto little pieces of who he is and let that be our perception of him. He wants to have this face-to-face relationship with us, that's dynamic and interpersonal and has this vulnerability. But anyway, it's a similar, very, very similar concept when people come to Christianity and have their one concept of Christianity, or this one aspect of God that is like the supreme aspect of God. And they hold that above the relational aspect with him actually. It's a really interesting thought. I like it.
You're making me so happy, Ray. I'm going to cry again. I was like an emotional basket case after I showed that video last class. It took me like 10 minutes to recover.
Aww.
I don't know why that touches me every time. I just love it.
It's so precious.
Anyways, that's beautiful. And you're absolutely correct. And if you look at John 14:6, where it says, I am the way, this is Jesus speaking, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh to the Father but by me. Well, surprise, surprise, surprise. What Greek word for truth do you think is being used in John 14:6? It's I am the way, the aletheia, and the zoe. You know, it's just like, oh my God. And in other passages, it says, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. It is God revealed. Jesus is God revealed. And it's just like, wow. So beautiful. And think about it in your own truth telling, right? I mean, most of us are pretty good about not telling a bold-faced, contradictory lie. Like if someone asks it, but oh, we're so good at veiling, right? And covering over and redirecting and those sorts of things. But this type of truth, it's just like if we covered everything over, and this is how I look at world religions too, in case you want to peek into my brain. I look at it just like the 5 blind men and the elephant, Christianity included. Sorry, Christians. And it's like a veil is covered it, the truth or the true religion or true spirituality. And we got the Muslims got one corner pulled up and they're seeing the leg, and we got the Jews another thing pulled up and they're seeing the trunk, and the Hindus can see the tusk, and the Buddhists can see the ear, and maybe the Christians can see the torso. And we're all arguing and yelling at each other about, no, can't you see the truth? Can't you see? And it's just like, only God has that entire view where he has the entire elephant or the entire truth uncovered. And so it makes me want to be humble. It doesn't mean I think, well, I do believe we can't know truth apart from God, quite frankly. I think that's it. And even then, I have to realize I'm still processing it through my mortal frame, through my limited ability to understand and process. But that kind of capital T, absolute, universal, objective truth, I believe is the domain of God alone. And all we can participate is in partial or subjective versions of that. Any comments, questions on that? I cannot tell you how many fight. Am I recording this? How many fights I've gotten in with evangelicals over truth. And because I'm really offended when they'll like slam their Bible down and just tell me that this is the absolute truth, or is the word of God, or yada, or they have absolute truth. And I'm just like, no, you have a belief, you have a personal idea of what you think that truth is. And I like to challenge them, like, can you tell me do you know any absolute truths? I do with my atheist friends too, though, who want to appeal to science or logic or reason or facts. And I'll just like, tell me a fact. I would love to hear a fact. But see, I'm a philosopher. I don't believe in facts. I think it was Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic, that said, everything you see is just a perspective, and everything you hear is only an opinion. And even if I told you absolute truth from God's own lips, from mine to yours, there's going to be a translation problem. Because whatever God whispered in my ear is probably going to be different than what's coming out of my mouth. And what's coming out of my mouth is probably different than what's going in your ear. So it's a problem. Not with the truth, with us.
Well, and I think that's why Jesus directed our search for truth into him. Not saying, these, I do believe that the scriptures are true, and I do hold more firmly to the concept that, God has preserved his word into what we have today, but also, Jesus's words were that he is the truth. And so in our search for truth, we are to turn to him, and to turn him, yes, through studying him and discovering who he is through scriptures, but also directly to him, through the Holy Spirit, being able to relate to him and understand him, because, Holy Spirit's the only thing that knows the mind of God, that, that is the essence of God. But yeah,
that would be my one qualifier or exception. I would say my only hope of even glimpsing the truth is by the quickening and illumining of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
Because without that, I'm just stuck in my own subjective perspective.
Mm-hmm.
It's true for me, but whoop-de-doo. Okay, so I love that. It's my favorite word for truth. Another way I would define truth would be that which is whole, complete, lacking nothing, does not change. But that's also how I would define the good and the beautiful. That which is whole, complete, lacking nothing, no flaw, not given to change. And remember, for the ancient Greeks, the good, the true, and the beautiful were synonyms, but they're also synonyms for God. And it's not like God does good, it's God is good. It's not just that God loves, God is love, right? It's we can use human words to talk about it, but it becomes trite by our understanding. That's all. Okay, so back to Heidegger and this phenomenology thing. So he's got to set up traps to find being and action. And he comes up with this brilliant way to do it. Did any of you see my chapel last November called Perception Equals Reality? I actually used Heidegger in chapel to teach toleration.
Yes, I was there.
Okay, so what Heidegger, he makes this distinction between, he talks about the worldhood of the world. And you could even break it down into like the classhood of the classroom, or the kitchenhood of the kitchen, or the yardhood of the yard. And there's certain tools or objects or things that go with that world. And if you saw, say, the garden rake in the kitchen, it would immediately light up to you because it doesn't belong there. Just like if you saw the mop out in the field between the rows of potatoes, it would light up for you because it doesn't belong there. It belongs in the kitchen. And so part of how we can catch being is by seeing things that aren't where they belong. Okay. So they're out of context. Another way is these two principles he rolled out between, I got to back up. He believes that we are being thrown into the world with other beings and things. So it's not solipsism. It's not just us projecting and everything revolves around what we're perceiving, but there is an actual world with other beings and other things or objects in it, subjects and objects, and we have been cast as being into the world. But here's the freaky thing is it's being running ahead of itself, trying to catch up to itself. That is the human condition. I know this took me a long time to wrap my head around, and I still might be butchering you, Heidegger. I'm sorry if I am, but I think I got it. Basically, did any of you see that movie Donnie Darko? I'm not recommending it, but there's a scene in there where he's sitting in the living, it's like at a house party, and in his mind, he's like thirsty or something, but it's kind of this darkly lit house and they're filming. He's in the living room watching TV with some friends, and all of a sudden out of his like solar plexus, it almost looks like a slinky, like a light slinky comes out, and it snakes its way through the living room, down the hallway, around the corner, into the kitchen, opens up the fridge, and then grabs a soda or whatever he's after. And while that's happening, so the camera's following this like slinky coming out of his solar plexus into the kitchen, and then once the fridge is open, it pans back to the living room, and he stands up, and he just follows that slinky trail to the fridge and then grabs whatever he was about to get. And I was just like, that's Heidegger. That's being ahead of itself, trying to catch up to itself, because our being is taking place where our consciousness lies. So even though your physical body may be in your room or at your computer or driving down the road, your being is where your consciousness lies, not where your physical body is. Okay. So we have these like mental projections running out into the world ahead of us, and we're like traipsing along with our flesh suit trying to catch up to our mental conscious being in the world. I just became aware of Heidegger when cell phones just kind of came out and were being mass produced for the common people, for the hoi polloi. And it was such a great example of what he was talking about. I'd see people walking around campus at San Diego State on their cell phones, and I realized they were not consciously with their bodies. How could I tell? They'd run into people. They'd trip over stuff. They were with who they were talking to. And so when they made the laws about you can't talk on your cell phone while you're driving, like hands-free driving, to me, that really doesn't solve the problem, because it's not a dexterity issue. We're certainly capable as humans, at least most of us, to drive with one hand and do something else like hold a phone with our other. The problem is your conscious awareness isn't on the road when you're talking to someone on the phone. You are wherever they are. And that's the real problem, not the dexterity issue. But our law doesn't address that. You can have someone on speaker, but it doesn't have to be a cell phone, right? It could be an argument you had with your roommate before you left the house or the apartment, or your significant other or your dog or whatever. And you're still thinking about that event, not where you are. I don't know if that would be being running behind itself because you're dwelt in the past, and you got to catch back up to where your body is now, because we're not still at our apartment. We're in the cafeteria now, or we're at dinner, or we're in the next day, and you're still consciously living in another time. And you're not being consciously aware now. You're not being here now. Okay.
Thought.
Yes.
Do you think, okay. Well, okay. The thing that popped in my head is, one, a lot of times living in the past or living in the future is associated with worry and anxiety. Because very often you're feeling worried about the past, and you're feeling anxious about the future if you're not living in the present, which it's just interesting that that is his concept of that is how humans are constantly, because Jesus's prescription is essentially to be in the present and not to worry about the future, not to think about the future. Jesus is saying, don't be in the state that Heidegger's saying you have to be and you're stuck in the state. Jesus says, no, don't be there. I've called you to trust me, to put your faith in what, I'm going to provide for you. Be in the present with me right now, aware of what my spirit's doing, what my kingdom's doing. So how do you think that plays? Because like, if you genuinely cannot be in the present, then what do you do with that?
I think you
Jesus, stop
absolutely
worrying about tomorrow.
in the
Stop
present.
having your being in there, in a sense.
Yep. And I think Heidegger is just kind of like observing this phenomena of being thrown into the world, running ahead of itself, like with its desires, or I guess you could say running behind itself with its regrets or whatever, and how to navigate that. But how do you catch being itself? And so that's where he rolls out this idea of ready to hand and present at hand. And so the world is full of ready to hand objects. They're simply there. We don't even think about them. And we don't need to think about them. If we had to be consciously aware of the billions of bits of information that were coming into us every second, it would just be overwhelming. In fact, I think that's a lot of what's happening in dreaming, is we're processing and cataloging stuff that happened through the day that we didn't even have time to deal with. At least that's how a lot of my dreams are. I just feel like I'm sorting and processing and categorizing. But this idea of a ready to hand world, as long as it's working, we're not aware of it. But once something isn't where it belongs, or it's broken, it lights up for us, and it moves from being ready to hand and in the background to being present at hand. And now our conscious awareness is focused on it. Like right now, the chairs that you're sitting in are ready to hand. Whoops, they just became present at hand because I mentioned them. And now maybe for the first time during our Zoom chat, you realize you're consciously aware you're sitting in a chair. It was just part of the background noise. You didn't need to process it. You didn't need to be aware of it. But if that chair broke and went out from under you, immediately it would go from ready to hand to present at hand. Same thing. We all have vehicles. I see the cars on my vehicle. I may even kick them and stuff, but I'm really not being consciously aware of them unless I go out and there's a flat. And then all of a sudden, like the eye of Sauron, all my focus is on that flat tire. And that's my reality until I get it fixed and it moves back into the realm of ready to hand. And the reason I used that in chapel was I just thought, even though it wasn't Heidegger's intention, probably quite far from it, I just thought it explains so much why it's hard for us to see the brokenness in the world for other people when the world's not broken for us. And that's why it was part of my multicultural chapel and diversity and inclusion. And I was just challenging the student body and the faculty and staff and myself to realize, just because something's not broken for you and the world's not lit up for you about a certain issue, does not mean it's not broken for someone else. And that particular issue or brokenness may be consuming all their energy and awareness. And for just a quick example, being a white bearded male gnome in America, um, the world's pretty ready to hand to me. Yet it's broken for me too, but not near as broken as it is for perhaps women or people of color or immigrants or people with disabilities or over a certain age. And this is part of what my back pain's been helping make present at hand to me is my body. And I've been very fortunate to have a very healthy life. And there's a Chinese proverb that says, no sickness, short life, little sickness, long life. Why is that a true proverb? It's so brilliant. No sickness, short life, little sickness, long life.
Well, my first thought is like immunities. Like if you never get sick, then you never build up any immunity against it.
I think you're being affected by the plague. That's a good answer, Autumn. But yes, that's quite contemporary. That could be one reason, sure. But I think it relates more to like my dad. He pretty much didn't take care of himself, didn't exercise. And then in his 50s, he found out he had diabetes and completely changed his diet, completely changed how he took care of himself. And it probably added a decade to his life, where if he hadn't got diabetes, he might have died of a heart attack 10 years earlier because he wouldn't have changed his diet. He wouldn't have. So I think it's that idea when we get a little sickness, it kind of wakes us up to we are mortal, we are physical. We can't just be so cavalier in what we eat or drink or do. And there might need to be some adjustments. And I just think it's a brilliant proverb. The way I related it, of course, to like whether it's people with disabilities or they feel discriminated in society or prejudice, racism, all of that. It's, are we willing to enter into the brokenness of those people's worlds so we can see it will light up for us too? Or are we living in such a ready to hand world that when people tell us that they've been subject to racism or sexism or classism or whatever isms you want, we just say, what are you talking about? There's none of that in this country. I don't see it. Well, just because you don't see it doesn't mean it's not happening to you, so it's not lighting up your world. But for other people, their whole world's lit up every day because of the brokenness. And that's kind of exhausting. I guess, I mean, you can see the parallels, right, between like being woke. It's kind of like the same idea of being present at hand or being aware. For Christians, I would prefer the term walking in the Spirit. I believe if you're walking in the Spirit, you get out of that egocentric, subjective perspective. Yes, you're still a self and you're seeing the world from a different perspective, but it allows you to get like a higher view when you connect to God or to the Spirit. And it's not just about you and your needs or your desires, but what's God doing? Those have been my like biggest prayers during this whole pandemic and political season and fire season and all of it. I'm just like, God, I have such a limited perspective. How am I supposed to even navigate all this stuff or know what to do or who to vote for or how to protect my family? Or we're just getting so many conflicting views and opinions. And so I just appeal to God. It's like, please give me insight. I would love to know what you're doing, but God hasn't clued me into why we had 2020 the way we did. But I still love him. I still trust him. I just don't understand.
Just a side note, I think it's really funny how people are like excited for 2020 to be over, and it's almost like they pretend like all the problems, everything that we face this year will end whenever it's 2021.
Right, when the ball drops New York, we get a restart. And it's just weird, right? How and that's like an arbitrary calendar date we made up. It's a human construct. It's not like.
I think of 2020 as hindsight for things to come.
Yeah, indeed. I hope not. God. Yeah, I'm ready for some of this stuff to change. But anyways, I love that about Heidegger. I don't like that he didn't renounce the Nazi Party. But I really liked his work on being in the world. It gave me a lot to think about and work with. And part of what's fun about being a philosopher, and maybe it's just me, maybe I'm just a weird perspective junkie, but like when we went through our book and we looked at all the different philosophers, well, what happens? I mean, this was obviously just a brief overview and sampler, but if you get in and you actually read the writings of Plato or Aristotle or Augustine or Aquinas or Heidegger, the more you read, it's almost like you start seeing the world through their eyes. And it's just the freakiest phenomena. And I just love it. I can't. So now I just have a satchel full of goggles that I can just reach into and pull out whenever I want. I can pull out my Heidegger goggles. I can pull out my Buddhist goggles. I can pull out my Aristotle goggles. And it's just such a fun way to see that. I mean, I'm never bored. Just there's so many perspectives. I just love perspectives.
I love the idea and that like image of perspective. That's really cool.
That will be my next book after I'm done with my tribute for Carl. What do you think about this title, or does it sound silly? Perspectacles.
I love it. That's hilarious.
I like it because it has the word spectacle in the middle of it. Perspectacles. But it sounds like icicles too, which I don't like that. I'll keep massaging it, but it's a lot about my like philosophy of origins class. If you took that with me, where I kind of show the difference between a theistic, pantheistic, and materialistic worldview, and how they can all be looking at the same object, but have wildly different understandings, or their interpretations are so different. Here's an interesting thing, and then I want to ask you guys a question. And it's a real question. It's not just a fake question. I'm really curious. But before I get there, St. Augustine made this shocking statement. He said, our perceptions are never wrong. St. Augustine, of all people. I was really adamant coming against that until he explained the next part. And he said, our perspective isn't the problem. It's our interpretation with our reason of what we think we're seeing. That's where the error takes place. And you might say, that's not true, Blackburn. A colorblind person is misperceiving the colors in the object. No, they're not. A colorblind person is seeing or not seeing the colors exactly how a person with those eyes should see them. If they were seeing color, that would be a problem, or the correct colors. Does that make sense? So the problem isn't in our perceptions of the world, it's what we do in our heads with the data we're taking in. That's where the error lies. And I just thought that was just quite insightful.
That reminds me of the whole evolution versus creation debate.
Yes, great example. It's a great example. You have people looking at the exact same bones, the exact same geological column, the exact same human or plant or animal, and coming up with just wildly different interpretations. When I was younger, feistier, I'd get on these creation evolutionist chat boards and where they're having knockdown drag-em-outs, and one of the favorite naturalist or evolutionist thing they would say is like, we have tons of evidence for evolution. Show us your evidence for creation. You've got zero. And I would just laugh, and I would just like, it's all the same evidence. It's all the same bones. It's all the same earth. It's all the same animals. It's not like you have your pile of evolution, pro-evolutionary evidence, and then there's this like non-existent pile of creation evidence. It's all the same pile. It's just we're looking at it from two different points of view and then interpreting it wildly differently. But it's the same evidence. That's why I'm a presuppositionalist and not an evidentialist, because I don't think it's about the evidence. I think it's about our perception and interpretation. Okay, you ready for my question? This is not easy. This, if it wasn't for my medication, it would be keeping me up at night. But we kind of have had since the Age of Enlightenment into the modern period, with the separation. Remember, theology and science used to be under the umbrella of philosophy, but both have become like disciplines in their own right. And we see religion or theology, and we see science, and at least in America, among evangelical America, I'm stunned how many believers or Christians or religious people are anti-science or hostile to science. And the same way, it's stunning to me how many religious people are dismissive or demeaning of those people of faith or who have religious beliefs. And yeah, there's exceptions where you have religious scientists, but I wouldn't say that's the norm, right? Especially in the hard sciences like chemistry, biology, botany, anatomy. And so here's my question. When theism or theology dominated, when the plagues came, what were the explanations, like the Black Death in Europe? What was the church saying about the plagues? Do any of you remember from history? I was a history major, so this is probably unfair. It's not part of my question. I'll just tell you, because this is all primer for the question. They simply would have had a theological explanation for it. Either God's punishing us for disobedience, God's testing us to see if we'll be faithful. The Jews are poisoning the wells. We need to get rid of the infidels. I mean, you had just this wild range because no one knew what was causing the death. That was what was so horrifying. And it's like today with the COVID. I'm hearing I'm just hearing crickets among theologians, religious people, as far as it comes to why are we having this pandemic. And maybe that's for the best, because at least people aren't saying it's because of homosexuals or because whatever other weird reasons people give for disasters and things happening to our country, right? And so I'd rather have silence than those sorts of answers, but I just feel like there's been no credible religious response to this. And if anything, I have personally, and this is my personal opinion, and I think this is recorded, I have been very put off and disgusted by the vast majority of evangelical Christians through all of this. And maybe that's my own issue and all that, but I'm not happy. And I'm not quite sure what to do about it right now. God and I are kind of wrestling through this, and I'm trying to listen and be open.
Are you saying that it's because of the silence of the church that kind of puts you off?
Not just the silence, but the complete, as going so far as to saying the pandemic is a hoax or the virus is a hoax. And I mean, I'm just like, And I've even clarified with my evangelical friends and colleagues and stuff. Like, do you mean what the liberal media or the Democrats did with the virus? Is that what you're calling a hoax? Because I could understand that perspective, but they're saying no, the very virus itself isn't, or they would say it's just like the common cold or a flu. And I'm just like, good Lord, please. And it makes it hard for me because, like, when my mama got COVID, these same people that told me it was a hoax told me they were praying for me, and that was really hard. It took all my self-control not to ask them, what are you praying about? There's obviously nothing wrong with my mom. It's a hoax. Science, on the other hand, has just been giving countless recommendations or solutions or causes or ways to deal with this pandemic. And you see the fuel that gives, especially to atheists or agnostics, when they're saying, here you believe you have an all-powerful God, creator of heaven and earth, who can make or break viruses, who can bring health or disease, prosperity or famine. And where's this God now? The religious are being affected like the irreligious, those that curse God or those that bless God. What does your religion have to offer as any form of solace or comfort or protection or purpose or meaning? Where on this hand, we have scientists who are using our understanding of the physical material world. They're using scientific method, they're doing tests, they're doing double blinds, they're creating vaccines, and they're fighting this pandemic. And I would say the message giving to the world, or at least in America, is science has answers, religion does not. So talk to me about that. That is my question. Is that true? Am I missing something? Am I being too critical? I have been wrestling with this for the last month. But it's hard to even have this conversation with Christians, as you can imagine, because it's easy to get really defensive. And I'm not trying to be attacking. This is part of what I've been asking God to show me is what are you doing? I mean, is this like a purification? Is it a purge? Is it like a separation? What is happening here? Now, I believe the scriptures told us what we should do in these sorts of situations, but I'll get to that later. What I'm addressing is, what does religion or theology or Christianity have to offer in terms of fighting a pandemic in contrast to what science is offering?
Well, I have to go here in a second because I have another class in a minute, but so I don't have time to answer the whole question. But in regards to leaders or Christian people who are a little more in spotlight, have a little bit more of a voice saying anything about it, I agree with you. I've kind of been frustrated, like we're so caught up in surviving or debating about what's going on. Have we paused to consider what God might be trying to teach us, not just individually, but like as a nation, as a country, as a world,
Yeah.
And I would definitely, I don't know if it's available anywhere, but potentially, I just got to see Ben Corson speak. He's John Corson's son. John Corson's written like a bunch of really cool commentaries that I enjoy a lot. And he just spoke up at Vista Calvary, potentially other places, and kind of had this thought that maybe God's taking this for sure to help us learn how to rest and to be still a little bit, to shift our focus on what is important. We're thinking about life and death a lot more. We're could get more of an eternal perspective. We're reminded family is important. The people around us are important. We don't get to see a lot of people, and we get to spend a lot of time with a couple people. That kind of, it definitely is a perspective shifter, as well as encouraging us, in the midst of slowing down, letting life being interrupted and resting, and actually like resting with God, letting him reset us, to also be productive, because he was saying, in a sense, Paul was, quarantined to his cell, right? And what did he do when he was stuck in his prison cell? He was writing. He wasn't just doing nothing. And so a lot of us have, it's very easy to be lazy in the midst of an overwhelming pandemic where you have 0% control over what's going on in the greater world outside. So I was really blessed by what he had to say. I felt like he had some interesting perspectives on what maybe God might be trying to teach us, as well as what we can do with what we have as Christians and what an appropriate kind of responses. And it was less of a how do we respond as the world, like to the rest of the world and to the conversations going on, and more of like, okay, what do you do with yourself? But I found it was really useful, as well as he really his passion is kind of attacking depression, which is really cool and very needed right now. So definitely suggest looking at Ben Course and seeing if he has any of those messages online that he's been giving recently. But yeah, it's definitely.
Thanks, Ray. That was a real blessing. And you need a pulpit or a podcast or something. I mean, and especially how you phrased it, and I know you were taking some from that Ben guy, but even how it's couched, it's not like, thus saith the Lord in the 20th year, I will bring plagues of destruction upon them, right? Those who dwelt safely. And it's more like, I'm not saying I know what God's doing, but I do know God and I know his character. And these are perhaps some of what he's trying to show us. I mean, that's a wonderful way to qualify it. You're not acting like you just stepped out of the Old Testament and you're a prophet bringing God's doom, but you're really trying to get into the mind and heart of God. I mean, I don't believe God is malicious or cruel or those things. And so like, wow, why is this like to awaken compassion for others? Is it to realize how much we have? Is it to focus on the few instead of the many for this season? Is it to have a greater appreciation of the health we've shared and prosperity, and we can create, we can be productive, and I think that's beautiful. And I know many churches are doing that. That instead of anxiety or fear, they've turned their focus to service, feeding people, sheltering people, medical needs. And I just think that is where the church, just like in the Middle Ages, when the Franciscans went out and died with the plague victims. And I'm not saying, let Jesus be your vaccine and just don't use any precaution. No, use wisdom, use discretion, but we also don't have to fear. And I do think we, as a good testimony, need to be submissive to the authority over us. But remember, that's an attitude. Obedience is conditional on what they're asking us to do. But even if you are going to disobey the government, you need to submissively disobey, not rail, these are our rights, you can't do this to us, yada, yada, yada. No, that's not the way of the cross. That's not a submissive attitude. That's pride, entitlement. And I just need wisdom on how to talk to other evangelicals about it. It's really difficult. And it's so polarizing. And
it's definitely hard.
I've been quiet for a long time, and I just don't know how much longer I will. Do you guys want another round, or are you good now? Do you feel sated?
For me, I think it's has brought me to like this level of acceptance, whether it be this way or this way.
Oh, never mind. Go ahead. I was just going to tell her I didn't think we were probably going to meet again to just work on her paper, but
okay. Yeah, so for me, it's been...
You have my full attention now, Wayne.
Thanks. Kind of like just coming to acceptance, you know. Either I might get it or I might not. But either way, if it happens, accept it. If it doesn't happen, accept it. And just kind of brings me into like just submitting for what God has for my life, no matter like what the season.
Yes.
So, but to answer your question, I don't think I can answer that question.
Yeah. And there may not be an answer for us.
Yeah.
But I do want to be open, and that's where I want my thoughts to be, like trying to not second guess God or all that, but to get out of my own, like how it's affecting me personally, and try to get a little bit bigger in the spirit thing. And because it's easy, right? I can be disgruntled or put off and all of that, and all the things I think are wrong, or people aren't doing it how I think they should. But how is that me being loving and helping those people? I mean, they may be reacting out of their own fears or paranoia or depression, or and can I be in the spirit enough where I can be a help to them rather than alienating them or making them feel judged or whatever.
Yeah.
So I have been learning a lot of self-control through this. And I get it. I'm super judgmental. I don't want to be. I think it's part of being a philosopher and all of that. We're always critiquing everything, and that includes people and movements and ideas. And I sometimes I just have to back up and say, Fred, yeah, who cares at this point? It's like, how are you loving on these people, especially the ones that don't see things the way you do? How are you loving them? It's easy to love people that are on the same bus with us or the same team, right? Rooting for the same people. But yeah, what about those that think we're off the wall? How do we minister to them? Any 2 cents from you, Autumn?
I think just for me, what I've seen is, you know, the Bible talks about multiple times how like the hearts of man will be revealed, and what happens in darkness will be brought to the light. And so I just feel like just through COVID, like if COVID didn't happen, then would BLM have exploded the way it did, or would, it's just interesting to look at events that happened in 2020,
Yes.
like after COVID, and think, would they have happened the same way if COVID hadn't happened? So I think in a lot of ways, like the hearts of man has been revealed. Like you can see where people's actual hope is. Like a lot of Christians who are genuinely just terrified, like every single day. And then you see like the contrast between people who are putting all of their hope and their strength in the Lord. So I just think it's been really interesting to see how like a lot of stuff that was hidden is now being brought to the surface.
Yes. And I guess that works both ways, right? We see the good and we see the not so good. And
yeah,
unfortunately, it has made me kind of look at people I've known for a long time very differently. And kind of like, because you know people for so long, it's like you kind of stop looking, right? You just have this kind of like template in your head of who that family member or friend or church member is all these decades or years. But then when something intense like this happens, all of a sudden, and I'm sure it's the same, people are having the same thing, like Fred is not who we thought Fred was all these years. I'm sure it works both ways, right? And I get it, and it's shocking at times, but sometimes it takes something this intense to kind of actually, people's veils are coming off, or whatever you want to call it, or mask, or it's interesting. I noticed, here, I'll do a little confession here before I let you go. I noticed I started keeping a list on my social media of people I knew that I thought were just saying ignorant and ridiculous things. And then one afternoon, I think it was the Holy Spirit, I heard this prompt in her voice. It's like, what's the list for, Fred? I was like, what? I was like, what's the list for, Fred? Are those people you're going to pray for or minister to? And I was like, oh, yeah, that wasn't what the list was for, Jesus. And he's like, yeah, I know. And so I stopped making a list. But that kind of revealed my heart, right?
Yeah.
I feel like it's also, for me personally, learning how to love God and worship God and not necessarily be transformed or affected by the things around me, if that makes sense. Of course, like taking it with wisdom and making sure that you know what it is you're talking about before you actually speak. But just like learning how to worship with people who think differently than me, like
Yes.
learning how to just spend time in relationship with God with people who think differently than me. That's like just been a really big lesson.
Yep. And it means like little deaths, right? We may have to lay down our preference or our music style we like, or the way we dress, or I mean, there's a lot of things that we may have to lay down if we want to minister in certain people's lives. And, we can be resentful about it, or we can do it with joy. Realizing what Jesus set aside for us. I mean, can we set aside some of our rights or freedoms for others? Yeah. All right. Well, that was wonderful.
All right. Have a blessed day and
Get me them term papers and we'll
get
call
our
it.
papers.
Right? You
All
have
right.
13th, I believe.
All right.
I need everything by the 13th.
Okay. All right. Well, be blessed. And it was a joy having this class.
Yeah, you too, Wayne. It's good to get to know you better, and
Yep.
it's unusual, but I thought this works really well for this topic.
It did. So, all right. See ya.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Thank you, Fred.
You're welcome. Take care.
You too.